Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 162 and it's titled Are Slivers Still Good If They're Enchantments? And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or working with a card suggested to us, working on a budget of $100 or less, and then building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is completely random, found it going through Scryfall, and that card is Basal Sliver. Basal Sliver is 2 and a black for a 2/2 creature, Sliver. All Slivers have sacrifice this creature, add black to your mana pool. So originally, I was looking at ways to make this an aristocrats deck, trying to sacrifice creatures, trying to figure out ways to take advantage of the Sliver creature type, and I realized I didn't want to go the traditional Sliver route of just playing a super powerful 5-color Sliver commander, just flooding the board and doing it that way, so I decided to go a little bit of a unique way, and although we are still playing Slivers, we cut a couple of colors, and we have a very unique commander this week, because our commander is Myrkul, Lord of Bones. So Myrkul has a lot of text, but he is 4 white, black, green for a 7/5 legendary creature god. As long as your life total is less than or equal to half your starting life total, Myrkul, Lord of Bones, has indestructible, and whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's an enchantment and loses all other card types. So there's a couple of unique interactions between Myrkul and some Slivers. First, it is important to note that when a Sliver dies and we exile it and bring it back as an enchantment, it is no longer a Sliver, so it will not get any of the benefits that the Slivers may give it. However, it does still give our creature Slivers those same abilities, and now that it's an enchantment, it's a lot harder to remove than a creature. It won't die to your normal board wipes, it won't die to a lot of targeted removal, so it's a great way to protect a lot of our creatures and still benefit from the effects that they give the rest of our creatures, because they're going to keep pumping up, well, the rest of our creatures. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the themes of this deck and try to piece together some of the things that we're doing. As I've already mentioned, our first theme is, of course, Slivers. We want to play as many Slivers in our colors as possible, and this is also going to allow us to do some things that a lot of Sliver decks don't normally do, because we get to play, obviously, the good Slivers that see play in every kind of deck, but also the very niche Slivers that really are only going to see play in ours. So, for example, we have an amazing Sliver here in Predatory Sliver, 1 and a green for a 1/1. Sliver creatures you control get +1/+1. Simple, straight to the point, nice and effective. But we also have in the Abzan colors a lot of Slivers that sacrifice themselves. We have Slivers that give that +1/+1, that do things when other Slivers enter, that give lifelink or death touch or anything like that. So we really get to play around with a lot of those effects. But what we miss out on is a lot of the evasion that comes from the blue and the red. We don't get those in our deck. The best evasion we're going to get is obviously going to be trample, but there's only 2 Slivers that can actually give trample in our colors, so we need to be very efficient with playing our Slivers and making sure that we can get enough of them on board to do enough damage, while still being able to push through if anyone has any blockers. Now, with that all being said, since our primary creature type is Sliver, we of course also want to play cards that reward us for playing creatures of a specific type. Now, Slivers do this on their own, right? Giving all Slivers whatever it might be, +1/+1 or Death Touch or Lifelink. But we also have cards that really want to reward us for picking and sticking to a single creature type, like, for example, Etchings of the Chosen, which is 1 white-black for an enchantment. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. It's going to be Slivers. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. Then we could pay 1 and sacrifice a creature of the chosen type, and target creature you control gains indestructible until the end of turn. This really synergizes incredibly well with what we're trying to do with the deck for multiple reasons. The first, obviously, it's giving all of our Slivers +1/+1, which is great. The second piece is that it can give our slivers indestructible, which is also great. But most importantly, and while this may not be very noticeable up front, it sacrifices our creatures. So if somebody goes to exile one of our creatures, one of our slivers, we can sacrifice it and then return it to the board with Myrkul, so we still get to keep the effect. Having an on-board sacrifice effect, even a one that costs mana, it's not the worst in the world. We have a ton of other ways to do this as well, but it's definitely worth paying attention to when it comes with so many upsides on one card. And then finally, we got to get into our last theme, which is, of course, drawing cards. Since our deck is almost entirely creatures, in fact, we're playing a total of 54 creatures in this deck, including our commander, we wanted to try to find ways to benefit from casting creatures and drawing cards, and one of the best ways we can do that is with Beast Whisperer, which is 2 green for a 2/3 elf druid. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. Now, I know this is not a sliver, so it doesn't quite work, but there aren't really any slivers that say when you cast a sliver, draw a card, at least none that I'm aware of. If I'm somehow missing one, please let me know. But Beast Whisperer, plus a couple of other cards that do very similar things, are one of the most efficient ways we have to keep our hand full, because almost everything in our deck is a creature, so we're able to keep churning out cards, we're able to keep drawing cards, and we're able to keep the pressure on our opponents. And like I said earlier, even when our stuff dies because of Myrkul, we can just get it back and keep the ability. That does apply to non-sliver creatures as well, so if Beast Whisperer happens to die, we can get it back and keep the card draw effect without having to keep the creature that's susceptible to removal. So this is a great way to synergize with everything we're doing, and a great way to make sure that we are always the aggressive deck at the table. Now, with all of that being said, though, let's jump into some of our key cards and take a look at some things that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are win conditions, and more often than not are really the cards we want to see come up in a game. So the first of these key cards is going to be Haunting Voyage. One of the few non-creature spells. It is 4 black for a sorcery. Choose a creature type, return up to 2 creature cards of that type from your graveyard to the battlefield. If this spell was foretold, return all creature cards of that type from your graveyard to the battlefield instead, and you can foretell it for 5 black. So it is very expensive to foretell this. It's 2 to foretell it and then 7 to cast it, so it's a 9 mana total investment. But this is a great way to make sure that we are protecting ourselves from board wipes before we get Myrkul online. Being able to return every single sliver from our graveyard to play can be potentially game-winning in a lot of situations, because there is a green sliver that provides haste. So if we are able to get a lot of our slivers back and we have haste, there's a chance that we can cast this from Foretell for 7 mana and just straight up win the game right there. So Haunting Voyage is incredibly powerful and is definitely one of the best win conditions in the deck, provided we haven't, of course, exiled our creatures to Myrkul and, still have them after a board wipe. Our next key card that we're going to talk about is in fact a sliver. This one is Gemhide Sliver, which is 1 and a green for a 1/1 sliver. All slivers have tap, add 1 mana of any color. This is by far one of the best ramp pieces in the entire deck, and there's a couple of them. We have Gemhide and we also have Mana Weft that do the exact same thing, except Mana Weft only lets our slivers tap for mana. Either way, they are both going to be absolutely amazing in this deck. Being able to turn all of our creatures into perfect mana dorks that can tap for mana of any color means we can really just keep churning through our deck. And if we can assemble a combination of cards like Gemhide, a sliver that gives haste, and a card draw effect, we can essentially cast a sliver, use it to cast another sliver, and we can do that until we run out of mana and just completely flood the board with creatures, all of which are pumping each other up, all of which are giving us extra benefits, and it's just a great way to maintain control of the board. But finally, we got to talk about our last key card, which is Regal Sliver. And I'll be honest, I saw Regal Sliver when it was originally spoiled, but I didn't think much of it. I personally have a 5-color sliver deck, and I didn't think Regal Sliver was going to be worth the cut in that deck. But honestly, after playing it a few times, It is absolutely one of the best slivers you could possibly be putting into a sliver deck. It is 3 and a white for a 3/3 sliver. Sliver creatures you control have, when this creature enters the battlefield, slivers you control get +1/+1 until the end of turn, if you're the monarch. Otherwise, you become the monarch. We've already talked a little bit about why card draw is so important in this deck. Being able to draw a card at the end of each turn because we're the monarch is incredibly powerful. Being able to play a sliver and just take the monarchy back from somebody means we don't have to hit them in combat, we can just take it. And if we are the monarch, this just becomes a massive pump effect that every single time a sliver enters the battlefield, it's giving everything +1/+1. If we can pull off the combo with Gemhide and a bunch of other slivers and card draw effects, and we can play 5, 6, 7 slivers in one turn, even if we only have one attacker at that point, it's getting +7/+7, plus there's a chance it has all the keywords like Trample and First Strike and Death Touch and Lifelink, and there's definitely gonna be times when we just play a couple of slivers and that is more than enough to pump up the entire team to lethal amounts. So I really can't talk up Regal Sliver enough in a sliver deck. It has by far won me over with its performance in some of the test runs that I've done with this deck. So if you haven't given it a shot in a sliver deck, please do test it out. It is absolutely amazing, and it's only 36 cents. It's just phenomenal. I'm gonna stop talking about it now because I could go on and on, but I'll spare you from that. So those are our key cards. The next thing that we want to do for our deck tech, though, is take a look at some of the cool interactions in the deck. These are cards that synergize very well together and in some cases can be value engines on their own. Now, obviously, a lot of these interactions are going to be between slivers, and slivers just kind of interact with each other well in general, so I'll do my best to explain why I'm mentioning each of these in particular. The first one that I want to talk about is going to be between Toxin Sliver and Talon Sliver. Toxin Sliver is 3 and a black for a 3/3 sliver. Whenever a sliver deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature, it can't be regenerated. And we can combine that with Talon Sliver, which is 1 and a white for a sliver. It's a 1/1. All slivers gain First Strike. Now, Toxin Sliver does not technically give Death Touch because they can't be regenerated, which is slightly better, but it's also a trigger that goes on the stack. It doesn't immediately kill a creature when it hits it. However, being able to give Toxin Sliver, or in fact any sliver, First Strike and the ability from Toxin Sliver means that they will hit the opponent's creature first, immediately kill it, and then not have to take damage in return. And there's a couple of different ways we can do this. We have a couple of First Strike slivers, we have a couple of Death Touch or destroy creatures on combat damage slivers. So there are a couple of other ways to assemble this combo, but I wanted to highlight these two because they really get overlooked in a lot of sliver decks, and I do think they're very worth the inclusion. So I just wanted to highlight them. Plus, I think the art's really cool, so very neat cards and a very cool interaction. But moving on to our second cool interaction, this one is going to be between Tempered Sliver and Bone Scythe Sliver. Tempered Sliver is 2 and a green for a 2/2 sliver. Sliver creatures you control have, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And Bone Scythe Sliver is 3 and a white for a 2/2 sliver that just says sliver creatures you control have double strike. So you can kind of see where this is going. If we just have these two creatures and they both attack, they're both going to hit once with double strike, trigger Tempered Sliver, put another +1/+1 counter on each of them, and then they're going to hit again, this time for 3, putting another +1/+1 counter on them. So now they're both 4/4s, and we just did 5 damage from each of them to our opponents for a total of 10 damage that was only happening because we attacked with 2 2/2s. So you can very clearly see how this gets out of hand with a huge board because it's essentially doubling a 2/2's power. Being able to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature every single combat is absurd, and that then gets them out of damage range for anything else that might be going on. So if somebody blocks with, say, a 2/2, they die to the First Strike, and then all of a sudden they've got to worry about, do we have Trample? Do we have other ways to push through damage so that we're still getting counters? It makes the combat math incredibly difficult for our opponents, even though it's all right there on board, there's a lot that they're going to have to remember when it comes to blocking our stuff. So that is the extent of our cool interactions, and now we're going to move on to the budget portion of this deck tech. Talk a little bit about how much the deck actually costs. And this week, our deck came in at a total of $77.37, with a huge portion of our budget being taken up by a single card in Roaming Throne. So Roaming Throne is 4 mana for a 4/4 artifact creature golem, ward 2. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Roaming Throne is the chosen type in addition to its other types, and if a triggered ability of another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time. This is far and away the most powerful effect we could have on the battlefield when we start triggering a lot of our creatures. Being able to use Regal Sliver to get +2/+2 every time a Sliver enters the battlefield, or being able to drain out our opponents when a creature attacks, or being able to exile a creature when a creature enters the battlefield or destroy something. This can absolutely turn the tide of a game, even if we only have just a couple of slivers in play. Roaming Throne, I really cannot talk up how good it is in this deck. And yes, it's good in most decks, but when a lot of our creatures are getting activated abilities, and they're activated abilities that can be triggered multiple times, or I suppose I should say triggered abilities, not activated abilities. They can be triggered multiple times. It is incredibly difficult to deal with because it's going to produce just so much value throughout the course of the game, and Roaming Throne is just hard enough to deal with. That ward 2 is just enough of an incentive for our opponents to not point removal at it, that it really gets tricky, and we really only need it in play for 1, maybe 2 turns to put ourselves in a position where it's almost impossible to stop us. So yes, Roaming Throne is $24.57 of our total budget, making up essentially a third of the entire deck on its own. However, I do think it's worth it, and if you do need to cut the card, you could find plenty of other slivers that we did not include and trim the price of the deck down close to almost $50. So that is the most expensive card in the deck, but I do have a suggestion for an out-of-budget upgrade as well. And while it's not technically out of budget, we could have squeezed it in, I didn't feel like increasing the deck's price too much, so if you don't mind increasing it just a little bit more, you could also include Kindred Summons, which is 5 green for an instant, choose a creature type. It's going to be slivers, obviously. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards of the chosen type, where X is the number of creatures you control of that type. Put those cards onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest of the revealed cards into your library. So if we have 5 slivers, we just search our library. Well, not search, I suppose. It's not quite that strong. Reveal cards from our library until we reveal 5 slivers and just put them into play. This is definitely one of those cards where the difference between revealing and searching is mostly irrelevant. It doesn't really matter which 5 slivers we get because they're all going to be buffing up our entire board and they're all going to make an impact, even if they may not be exactly the ones that we're looking for. Now, if you are taking a card out of the deck to put a card in, obviously you want to take one out that's not quite pulling its own weight, and unfortunately in this case that would be Plated Sliver, which is simply a 1 white for a 1/1 sliver. All slivers get +0/+1. While this is not the worst sliver in the world, it's by no means the best sliver in the world. Getting that additional +1 to toughness is okay, but it's not going to change a lot of combat math in the long run. It's not giving an extra boost to its power. It's not giving any keywords. It really makes it a defensive ability, and we really want to be anything but defensive in this deck. We always want to be aggressive. We always want to be on the attack. If we're getting to the point where we have to defend against somebody else, we're probably in a pretty bad spot, and if that's the case, +0/+1 isn't really going to help us much anyway. So Plated Sliver is decent as a 1-drop, but if we're looking at pure power, we have enough power in the lower slots to really justify putting in a 7-mana spell in Kindred Summons. So those are all of our budget upgrades, all of our deck tech stuff. So we're going to move on to the game with this deck, see how the deck actually performs, However, before we get to that, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So as always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. Everyone who does that, you are amazing, and I appreciate you all so much. And there's, of course, always still time to subscribe to the channel if you're not already. But if you're looking to go a bit above and beyond, you can find us on Twitter, Reddit, find us on Gmail if you need to send us a question, and you can also help support us on Patreon and right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get some amazing benefits and you get to join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard. So to all of you, thank you all so much. And to everybody who has watched this far in the video, thank you again. And I want to very quickly, before we get into the next segment, if anyone has been keeping track of how many times I've said the word sliver throughout the course of this video, please do let me know, because I feel like I've said it so many times it has stopped sounding like a word to me. So I would be interested to know how much we've actually said it. But with that being said, let's actually jump into a game with this deck and see how we do. So this week we are joined by 3 opponents. We have Doodle playing Faceless One and Candlekeep Sage. We have Josh playing Ragadraga Gorgut's Boss, and we have Luke playing Rune-Tail Kitsune Ascendant. So starting off with Doodle and his Faceless One Candlekeep Sage deck, you might notice Faceless One is really not doing much here. It's just a colorless, in this case green, commander that has choose a background, and his background that he chose is Candlekeep Sage, so that he draws a card whenever the Faceless One enters or leaves the battlefield. And you might be thinking, why play Faceless One instead of any other green commander? And the short answer is that because it is a colorless commander, there are ways for Doodle to reduce the cost of it and find ways to combo with it that you may not otherwise be able to do. So for example, Food Chain would sacrifice it and add an extra mana, so if he can reduce the cost of it by 1, he's able to continuously recast it to draw his entire deck, and while not essentially make infinite mana, all he would have to do is reduce it by 2, and then he starts generating infinite mana. So it's essentially a combo deck that wants to draw its entire deck. I'm not 100% sure what the win condition is after that. I'm sure Doodle will let people know if anyone's interested, but still a very cool concept, and I'm very excited to see Faceless One because you really don't get to see it very often, and the art on it is just amazing, so it deserves a little bit of spotlight. Next up, we're going to move to Josh's Ragadraga Gorgut's Boss deck. This deck is definitely a very interesting one. I haven't actually played against Ragadraga before, but I imagine it's a lot of mana dorks playing Llanowar elves and Elvish mystics and Fyndhorn elves and things like that want to be tapping for mana, because then if they're a 1/1, they become a 3/3 with Ragadraga. Plus he gets to spend a ton of mana, make his stuff absolutely massive, do a ton of damage in combat, do a ton of damage after combat. So I'm very excited for this one. This is a deck that is very up my alley in terms of playstyle. I absolutely love just kind of beating face with some Gruul shenanigans, so I am looking forward to this one. And then last but not least, we have Luke playing Rune-Tail Kitsune Ascendant, which you might notice has, when you have 30 or more life, you flip Rune-Tail Kitsune Ascendant. Since Commander starts at 40 life, Luke's goal is really just to play it and immediately flip it, which, when it flips, turns into Rune-Tail's Essence and prevents all damage that would be dealt to creatures he controls. This is essentially a pillow fort deck that wants to prevent damage to his creatures and then find ways to redirect the damage that would be dealt to him to his creatures, which is then prevented, meaning there's not really a way for him to lose the game outside of something like mill or an opponent auto-winning the game with some kind of card. Now, because of that, he also wants to be gaining life and preventing attacking, so I do think that all in all, our most important threat at this table is probably Luke's Rune-Tail deck, because I imagine if he can get Rune-Tail and then something that can block a ton of creatures or prevent damage to him and redirect it to a creature, I really don't know what we do to try to win. We can try to trample over his creatures, but again, if he's redirecting the damage, then that's not going to help us. So it's a really tricky situation, and we don't have a ton of enchantment removal in the deck. We have a little bit, but we can't really bank on drawing it every single game. So I do think that that's going to be our biggest threat at the table. But let me know down in the comments which deck you think might be the hardest for our deck to take on. And then, of course, let me know what your prediction is for the game. Gotta get those in now before you actually see the ending. So let me know what you all think. Hopefully you all enjoyed the deck tech. Hopefully you will enjoy the gameplay. I know I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Doodle goes first, followed by Josh, myself, and then Luke. On Doodle's first turn, he plays a City of Brass and uses it, losing a life, to cast Carpet of Flowers, letting him make mana in his main phase equal to the number of islands an opponent controls, but unfortunately for Doodle, none of his opponents are playing blue. On Josh's turn, he plays a Forest and casts Elvish Mystic. On my turn, I play a Temple of Plenty, scrying 1. Luke plays a Plains. Doodle plays an island, then casts Bloom Tender. Josh plays a forest, casts an Ornithopter of Paradise, and then also casts Llanowar Elves. I play a swamp, and I cast Basal Sliver, giving all slivers +1/+1. Luke plays a Plains and casts Endless Atlas, letting him tap it to draw a card, but only if he has 3 or more lands with the same name. Doodle plays a Botanical Sanctum, then casts his background Candlekeep Sage, letting him draw a card whenever his commander enters or leaves the battlefield. Josh plays a Forest and casts Rhythm of the Wild, giving all his creatures Riot and preventing them from being countered. Unfortunately for Josh, Doodle has a response, exiling a blue card from his hand to cast Force of Will, losing a life and countering the Rhythm of the Wild. Josh then goes to combat and attacks Doodle for 2 with his elves. I play a Plains on my turn, then cast Predatory Sliver, giving all my slivers +1/+1, and move to combat attacking Luke for 3. Luke plays a Plains and casts his commander, Rune-Tail Kitsune Ascendant, which immediately transforms since he has more than 30 life, turning into Rune-Tail's Essence, preventing all damage that would be dealt to creatures he controls. Doodle plays a Hinterland Harbor and casts Rhystic Study, letting him draw a card whenever an opponent casts a spell unless that opponent pays an extra mana. On Josh's turn, he immediately casts Return to Nature, destroying Doodle's Rhystic Study, paying an extra mana so Doodle doesn't even get to draw a card. He then casts Dolmen Gate, preventing all combat damage that would be dealt to attacking creatures he controls. On my turn, I play a Forest and cast Beast Whisperer, letting me draw a card whenever I cast a creature spell, then I move to combat, attacking both Josh and Luke for 3. Luke casts a Pristine Talisman, tapping it to make a colorless mana and gain a life, but can't do anything with the mana, so he passes. Doodle casts Wilderness Reclamation, letting him untap all his lands in his end step, which he immediately does as he passes for turn. Josh casts his commander, Ragadraga Gorgut's Boss, giving his creatures with mana abilities +2/+2, untapping them when they attack, and whenever he casts a spell by spending 7 or more mana, he untaps target creature and gives it +7/+7 in trample until the end of turn. This lets him attack Doodle for 6 with his 2 mana dorks, untapping them when they attack. I play a Forest and cast Regal Sliver, drawing a card and giving all my slivers +1/+1 whenever a sliver enters under my control if I'm the Monarch, and if I'm not the Monarch, then I become the Monarch, which is what happens this time. I then attack Luke for 6, and at the end of turn, I draw a card since I'm the Monarch. Luke casts a Palace Guard, which can block any number of creatures, and since he used the talisman to pay for it, he gains a life. Then at the end of turn, Doodle casts Chord of Calling for X=2, searching his library for a creature with mana value 2 or less, in this case Sanctum Weaver, putting it into play. On Doodle's turn, he casts a Mystic Remora, drawing a card whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, unless that player pays an additional 4 mana. He then casts his commander Faceless One, drawing a card when it enters, then plays a Rejuvenating Springs, and at the end of turn, Doodle untaps his lands with Wilderness Reclamation. On Josh's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking Doodle for 10 with his Elves and Raga Draga, and attacks me for 2 with Ornithopter of Paradise, untapping all his mana dorks. Before the blocks, Doodle casts Krosan Grip, destroying Dolmen Gate. This lets him block Raga Draga with Faceless One and Bloom Tender, but before the damage, Josh casts Silk Guard for X equals 1, putting a +1/+1 counter on Raga Draga and giving his modified creatures hexproof until the end of turn, not paying for Mystic Remora, so Doodle draws a card. This lets Raga Draga survive combat while both of Doodle's creatures die, drawing him another card, then he takes 6 damage, I take 2, and Josh becomes the Monarch, drawing for it at the end of turn. On my turn, I play an Exotic Orchard, then cast Talon Sliver, drawing a card, reclaiming the Monarchy, and giving all Slivers first strike. I move to combat, attacking Josh for 8 with Regal and Muscle Sliver, and he blocks Muscle Sliver with Ornithopter of Paradise, only taking 5, then at the end of turn, I draw for being the Monarch. Luke plays a Plains and casts Angel of Destiny, which, whenever his creatures deal combat damage to a player, lets both Luke and the defending player gain that much life. In Doodle's upkeep, he pays 1 for Mystic Remora's cumulative upkeep cost, then casts Confounding Conundrum, drawing a card and returning an opponent's land to their hand whenever they play more than 1 land a turn. He then plays a Forest and casts Root Maze, making artifacts and lands enter the battlefield tapped. After that, he recasts his commander Faceless One, drawing a card when it enters, and in his end step, he untaps all of his lands. Josh plays a Mountain tapped on his turn, then casts Birds of Paradise, and attacks me with Ornithopter of Paradise for 2, and attacks Doodle for 11 with everything else, untapping all his mana dorks on attacks. Then Doodle blocks Raga Draga with Faceless One, killing it, drawing a card and taking 6, while I take 2 and Josh becomes the Monarch. Second main phase, Josh casts Shamanic Revelation, drawing 5 total cards since he controls 5 creatures, and gaining 4 life since he has 1 creature with power 4 or greater. Unfortunately for Josh, he's unable to pay for Mystic Remora, so Doodle draws a card, letting him cast Swan Song, countering the Shamanic Revelation and giving Josh a 2/2 bird token instead. At the end of turn, Josh draws for being the Monarch, then still at the end of turn, I cast For the Ancestors, letting Doodle draw another card, and naming Sliver, looking at the top 6 cards of my library, revealing all Slivers from among them, putting them into my hand, and putting the rest on the bottom of my library. This winds up letting me put Victual Sliver, Manawef Sliver, Fungus Sliver, and Basal Sliver into my hand. On my turn, I play a Blighted Woodland tapped, then cast Manawef Sliver, drawing a card, becoming the Monarch, and letting my Slivers tap for a mana of any color. I then cast my commander, Myrkul, Lord of Bones, drawing a card and letting me exile my creatures as they die to make token copies of them that are enchantments instead of creatures. I move to combat, attacking Josh for 5 with Regal Sliver, then at the end of turn I draw for being the Monarch. On Luke's turn, he cast Moonblessed Cleric, gaining a life and searching his library for an enchantment, specifically Indestructibility, putting it on top of his deck. He then attacks me for 4 with Angel of Destinies, having both of us gain 4 life and letting Luke take the Monarchy. At the end of turn, Luke draws the Indestructibility he put on top of his deck, since he's now the Monarch. In Doodle's upkeep, he pays 2 mana for Mystic Remora's cumulative upkeep, plays an island tapped, then recasts his commander Faceless One, drawing a card when it enters. Then, in his end step, he untaps all of his lands. On Josh's turn, before he can move straight to combat, Doodle casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift, returning all non-land permanents he doesn't control to their owner's hands. In response, Luke activates Endless Atlas to draw a card, then the board wipe resolves. In Josh's second main phase, he recasts Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, and Ornithopter of Paradise, which unfortunately comes into play tapped since it's an artifact. He then plays a Gruul Turf, returning a forest to his hand. I play a Swamp, tapped, and then recast Mana-Weft Sliver, and recast Regal Sliver, retaking the Monarchy. I also cast Plated Sliver, giving all slivers +0/+1, then when I moved my end step, I draw for being the Monarch and discard to hand size. On Luke's turn, he recast his commander, Rune-Tail, once again transforming it to prevent all damage that would be dealt to his creatures, then he also cast Weathered Wayfarer. In Doodle's upkeep, he doesn't pay the cumulative upkeep for Mystic Remora, sacrificing it, then plays a Vine Glimmer Snarl and casts Collector Oof, preventing the activated abilities of artifacts from being activated. He immediately casts Eldritch Evolution to sack the Oof, searching his library for a creature with mana value equal to 2 plus the mana value of the sacrificed creature. In this case, getting an Eidolon of Blossoms, putting it into play, drawing a card whenever it or another enchantment enters under his control. He then casts Mist Hollow Griffin, which can be cast from exile, then at the end of turn, Doodle untaps all of his lands. On Josh's turn, he plays a Mosswort Bridge, hiding away a card, and recasts his commander, Ragadraga. He then attacks Doodle for 6 with his 2 elves, and Doodle blocks with Mist Hollow Griffin and Faceless One, killing all 4 creatures, letting Doodle draw a card but take no damage. On my turn, I play a Temple of Silence, scrying 1, and cast Bone Scythe Sliver, giving all my slivers double strike, and since I'm the Monarch, giving all my slivers +1/+1 until the end of turn. I then recast Predatory Sliver, giving all my slivers +1/+1 and another +1/+1 until the end of turn. I recast Talon Sliver, giving all my slivers first strike and another +1/+1 until the end of turn. Then I move to combat, attacking Doodle with my 3 slivers that can attack for a total of 32 damage, so even though he blocks 16 of it, he still takes enough damage from the other 2, getting knocked out of the game. Then at the end of my turn, I draw a card for being the Monarch. On Luke's turn, since an opponent has more lands than he does, he activates Weathered Wayfarer to search his library for a land, specifically Castle Ardenvale, putting it into his hand and then playing it for turn. After that, he recast Palace Guard and passes. On Josh's turn, he plays a Forest and casts Awaken the Woods for X = 5, making 5 1/1 Forest Dryad land creature tokens. Also, since Josh spends 7 mana on the spell, this triggers Ragadraga, untapping Birds of Paradise and giving it +7/+7 until the end of turn. This lets him attack Luke for 9 with the bird, untapping it on attacks. On my turn, I cast a Dregscape Sliver, giving all my slivers Unearth for 2 mana, and also triggering Regal Sliver, giving all my slivers +1/+1 until the end of turn. This lets me unearth Muscle Sliver, giving all slivers +1/+1, then another +1/+1 until the end of turn, and I cast Brood Sliver, letting anyone make a 1/1 sliver token whenever a sliver they control deals combat damage to an opponent, which also gives my slivers another +1/+1 until the end of turn. I move to combat, attacking Josh with my entire board for 86 damage, but since they don't have trample, he's able to easily block all of them with his Forest Dryads and Birds of Paradise, casting Heroic Intervention before damage with his Mosswort Bridge to give all his permanents hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. At the end of turn, I exile the unearthed Muscle Sliver and draw a card for being the Monarch. Luke plays a Rogue's Passage and activates Weathered Wayfarer to search his library for a land, choosing Throne of the High City, putting it into his hand. He then casts Cleansing Nova, destroying all creatures. On Josh's turn, he plays a Spire Garden and casts Marwyn the Nurturer, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another elf enters under his control, and taps for green mana equal to its power. I recast Beast Whisperer and then cast the card of the week, Basal Sliver, drawing a card and letting all slivers sacrifice themselves to make 2 black mana. At the end of turn, since I'm still the Monarch, I draw a card. On Luke's turn, he plays a Throne of the High City, then recasts Angel of Destiny, and also casts a Cartographer's Hawk. Josh casts a Viridian Joiner, putting a +1/+1 counter on Marwyn, then recasts his commander, Ragadraga. I play a forest and cast Primordial Sage, drawing a card and letting me draw another card whenever I cast a creature spell. I then cast Mind Whip Sliver, drawing 2 cards and giving all slivers the ability to pay 2 and sacrifice themselves to make target player discard a card at random. Luke casts Indestructibility, enchanting Angel of Destiny to give it indestructible, and then also casts Pariah, enchanting Angel of Destiny, so any damage that would be dealt to him is dealt to Angel of Destiny instead. He moves to combat, attacking Josh for 4 with the Angel of Destiny, and me for 2 with Cartographer's Hawk, having us gain life equal to the damage we're dealt, while Luke gains 6, becomes the Monarch, returns Cartographer's Hawk to his hand, and searches his library for a Plains, putting it into play tapped. Then, at the end of turn, he draws for being the Monarch. Josh casts Heron Blade Elite, getting a +1/+1 counter whenever another human enters under his control, and can tap for mana equal to its power. I play a Temple of Malady, scrying 1, then recast my commander Myrkul, drawing 2 cards. Luke plays a Plains and attacks me for 4 with Angel of Destiny, gaining us both 4 life. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Palisade Giant, so all damage that would be dealt to Luke or another permanent is now dealt to the Giant. After that, he casts a Selfless Spirit, which can sacrifice itself to give all his other creatures indestructible until the end of turn, then he draws for being the Monarch. On Josh's turn, he casts Cloth's Will for X = 5, destroying up to 5 artifacts or enchantments, targeting Pariah, Indestructibility, and Rune-Tail, but since he spent 7 mana, he also untaps Marwyn and gives her +7/+7 and trample until the end of turn. This lets him attack Luke for 11 with Marwyn, untapping her when she attacks. Luke takes the damage but redirects it to his Palisade Giant, and also sacrifices his Selfless Spirit so that the Giant lives and Luke takes no damage, also keeping the Monarchy. I play a Plains and cast Constricting Sliver, giving each sliver I control the ability to exile another target creature until that sliver leaves play. When it enters, I exile Palisade Giant, draw 2 cards, and become the Monarch. I attack Luke with my entire board for 17 damage, reclaiming the Monarchy. Then, in my second main phase, I cast Roaming Throne, naming Sliver, so that it doubles all the triggers of other slivers I control. This lets me draw 2 cards and exile Marwyn until it leaves play, then I draw for Monarch at the end of turn. Luke plays a Plains and casts Resurrection, returning Moonblessed Cleric from his graveyard to the battlefield, then searching his library for an enchantment, choosing Darksteel Mutation, putting it on top of his library. He also recasts Cartographer's Hawk and casts Test of Endurance, letting him win the game in his upkeep if he has 50 or more life. Josh casts a Leyline of Abundance, letting his creatures tap for an additional green mana. On my turn, I unearth Dregscape Sliver, exiling Angel of Destiny and Moonblessed Cleric, letting me also unearth Regal Sliver, giving all my slivers +2/+2 until the end of turn, and exile Cartographer's Hawk, but due to a deal I made with Josh, I do not exile any of his creatures. I also unearth Bone Scythe Sliver, giving all my slivers an additional +2/+2 as well as Double Strike, then I unearth Predatory Sliver, giving my slivers another +3/+3. Finally, I cast Horn Sliver, giving all of my creatures Trample, drawing 2 cards, and an additional +2/+2. Thanks to all the pumps, I'm able to attack Luke for 21 damage and Josh for 162 damage. Before blocks, Josh casts Kamal's Will, turning all his lands into 1/1 creatures with Vigilance, Indestructible, and Haste, and also having all his creatures do damage equal to their power to my Horn Sliver, killing it. Unfortunately for Josh though, I just exile it with Myrkul, returning it to play as an enchantment so my slivers still have trample. Then, even after Josh blocks as much as he can, he and Luke both still take a lethal amount of damage, knocking them both out, and winning me the game. All right, so that was a sweet game. I think Doodle, unfortunately, got a little bit unlucky. He played a ton of very powerful spells that definitely made him the archenemy, but he couldn't quite find the ways to mitigate some of that damage. He kept taking hits and getting attacked because he's playing things like Rhystic Study and Force of Will and the Mist Hollow Griffin. So there were a lot of value engines and combo pieces that came out of his deck, but he couldn't find the ways to keep himself alive. I think that if he'd been able to find those pieces, he probably would have wound up winning the game, so just a bit of an unlucky draw this time. Luke's deck did what it wanted to do. He really just made sure that he was shutting down combat, making sure he wasn't getting hit. I think one of the biggest things that he ran into that was a struggle was that each of his opponents really had a ton of ways to interact with enchantments, which meant that we had ways to get rid of the Rune-Tail and then start chipping in for damage. I think that if we'd been playing decks that didn't have a ton of enchantment removal, maybe mono black or maybe mono blue, it might have been a great way for him to not really do much in the game, in the sense that he didn't have to get involved in combat, he didn't have to do anything, he could just kind of sit back in his pillow fort and win. But unfortunately, every single one of his opponents was playing green, which was very efficient at dealing with enchantments. And then of course we got to talk about Josh's deck. Playing a ton of mana dorks and just kind of getting in for a bunch of damage over the course of the game was very, very cool. I think the Awaken the Woods, if it weren't for the board wipe, probably could have been game winning for him. Being able to have 5 creatures that could tap for mana that are all 3/3 creatures, which would then attack and untap and be able to pump up his team by casting spells that cost 7 or more. It really felt like he had the perfect setup for it. And I think that if he'd been able to remove our Trample Sliver on that last turn, there is actually a solid chance he probably turns it around. But unfortunately, Myrkul just incredibly powerful, and the Slivers, even without blue and red, still doing Sliver things, being able to just pump up everything. And like I said earlier, I really underestimated the power of Regal Sliver when I first saw it. I also very much underestimated the power of Dregscape Sliver. Being able to unearth every Sliver for 2 mana is insanely powerful, especially late game, and we can unearth 4 or 5 slivers in a single turn. They've all got haste, they're all triggering each other's abilities, they're getting in for damage. It really felt just incredibly explosive, but at the same time incredibly resilient. Knowing that we had Myrkul to kind of back up our board felt like there were a couple of times when we really just couldn't lose as long as we had our commander in play. So I was very impressed with the deck. I'm very happy with how this one turned out. Slivers was a little bit of background, I suppose. Slivers was actually my very first commander deck I ever played. It was a 5-color sliver deck because, you know, I felt like I just wanted to start my commander career with some violence, I guess. So very happy with the deck, very happy with how it turned out, and the game, of course. Very nice to take down a win with some slivers. But let me know down in the comments if you have any suggestions for future videos. I have quite a few at the moment, but I am always happy to try to get to more. And then, of course, let me know if you liked the game, if you liked the deck tech. If you did, please do actually like the video. And then let me know down in the comments if there's anything that I missed. So thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.